On the table. Oh, sorry. No, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Judy, please. This is old-style Romanian politeness. It's disappearing fast. I'll ask everyone to join us for this last part of our conference. I cannot say how happy we are to have Judy Dempsey at our conference. She's a remarkable thinker and someone who has basically influenced the conversation about our values and our future in multiple ways. As a very influential journalist for the Financial Times and then for the International Herald Tribune, and now in her current position, a blog and comments that I read every day, or every day I receive something from Carnegie Europe and from the Strategic Europe, which is the professional blog of Carnegie Europe that Judy is basically the editor-in-chief. So I think there is no better person to discuss this overarching theme of our conference is Western action still possible? We talked about the storm in the Black Sea, we talked about Turkey, Russia, everything else. But in the end, the question is the West still a cohesive, coherent, and predictable strategic and political player? And this is where I would like to start our conversation. Just yesterday, you published, there's something Judy asks, that was Mircea asks. We switch roles now. Yesterday, she asked a number of very influential people and friends, is Italy the Achilles heel in Europe? And then a few weeks ago, she asked, is Germany and Chancellor Merkel still up to the task? And then Judy asked, is Europe the last resort defender of multilateralism in the world? So Judy, is the West still an entity which is coherent and viable and predictable? Yeah, but just a bit closer.
Thank you, Aspen and the GMF for having me here. Secondly, it brings back very strange memories because I was in this palace 2 days after Ceausescu was executed, and I remember in the mid-80s when he launched the works for this palace, so my memory goes back quite a while for good or bad. So let me deal straight with the question. One is we have to define the West. The West was clearly definable before 1989. We knew where we stood with the Cold War. The West had a united, coherent alliance, which was anchored on NATO. And don't forget the European Union, which people do forget that this was absolutely supported in the late 1940s by the State Department, Dean Acheson particularly. It was so important, this dual transatlantic alliance, the economic one for Europe and the military one embraced in NATO, and of course the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which took Europe out of the rubble. So, but the idea of the West has changed. Geographically, the West is still there. That's the good news. But politically, I think the expectations have changed, and now, and it's been changing for some time, the cohesion of the West. And I suppose the biggest break came, I think, the Iraq War in some ways. I mean, 9/11 was a huge existential attack on the leader of the West. The Iraq War chiseled away at the Western unity. We all remember what happened. NATO was nearly on the verge of breakdown. And we pulled ourselves together. But now we have 2 or 3 important aspects which is testing the West's resilience. One is what Vladimir Putin is doing. He's now in Austria today, being courted, being welcomed, called in sanctions, celebrating 50 years of the energy ties, being given the red carpet treatment completely. We have calls by other countries. We have the new right-wing populist coalition in Rome wanting to drop the sanctions as well. So we have no idea where Trump stands on this. Absolutely no idea. Hot and cold. But and then we have Angela Merkel's very difficult decision on how far she should support President Emmanuel Macron for the future direction of Europe. So this is one element of not the fragility, but the dynamics taking place in the West. The other one is, of course, how the West is going to deal with China. We see what President Trump is doing. And the third one is the United States. It'll be very interesting what happens at the NATO summit. Will President Trump really lash out again at Angela Merkel, who seems to be his number one, who seems to be the number one victim of actually Trump's dislike over trade policy and other issues. So the West is not in good shape. It could be in much better shape, but is going to demand Europe and the United States to think in the long term, not to react to every tweet.
That's a long list of issues. But you mentioned President Putin visiting Vienna today. And you also mentioned that in the new, let's say, the manifesto and the governing program of the new Italian government, the lifting of the sanctions against Russia is an explicit issue. And would you consider this dealing with Russia from a US perspective and also from the fracture line between, let's say, more Atlanticist countries like Poland or Romania, let's say, and President Macron was in St. Petersburg just a few days after the announcement by the Trump administration of the withdrawal from the Iran deal. And I think there was no coincidence that they showed up together. I remember vividly watching the news the same day, I don't know which channel, I think Euronews or CNN or something. They broadcasted live at the same time, on half of the screen, President Trump with the 3 Baltic presidents in Washington celebrating the centennial of the Baltic independence. Romania, by the way, also celebrates this centennial this year. And the other half of the screen were President Erdogan, Putin, and the President of Iran in a joint press conference at the same time in Istanbul. So my question is, how divisive is this Russia thing in the dealings within Europe and also between Europe and the United States?
Remarkably, the EU is held together so far. Firstly. Secondly, I think there's a growing awareness in the bigger countries, and that includes, I think it includes Romania as well, but generally there's a growing consensus of the power and the danger of disinformation and fake news, which we'll touch on in the next session. And the institutions in the EU are beginning to deal with this. Say, I could answer this counterintuitively. Putin can only sit back and look at the damage done now in transatlantic relations. Tearing up the Iranian deal, yes, there were flaws in it, but tearing it up leaves us with very little options. And in some ways it gives Iran, if the Ayatollahs seem to go this way, a free hand to even pursue even more its geostrategic ambitions in the Middle East. They're doing enough damage as it is. But the nuclear deal, if we believe in non-proliferation, was one of the few success stories. And it's a very long term, it's 12 years old, you could monitor it, and the Iranians went very far in accepting it. And by tearing it up, in some ways, I don't want to be Trump bashing, but Trump has weakened this transatlantic commitment to non-proliferation, which is a very precious issue that has bound the West. Might I say that the former George W. Bush threw out some nuclear deals as well, the ABM treaty and so on. But we have to be very aware that it's very fragile now, the transatlantic relationship. And Putin can do what Putin has a measure of a free hand at the moment. And I think it beholds the big EU member states to look at the bigger picture and just don't throw everything aside. There's too much invested in the transatlantic relationship now, and to keep bashing Trump is no solution. Trump is not America.
Thank you. You mentioned the fact that President Trump has, in a way, closed in on Chancellor Merkel, not as a person, but as a leader of what we call a surplus country. Mm-hmm. And the way in which President Trump and his administration are approaching the free trade deals and the commercial deficit or surplus seems to be a sort of a relatively homogeneous approach from the Trump administration. The decision in Berlin not to increase military spending and the white paper on defense of the German Bundeswehr and the decision of the new government in Berlin to spend only 1.28% of GDP up to 2025 or something provoked a significant reaction. Is this the tariff on steel and aluminum and the threat that if Europe will reciprocate tit for tat for that, the German automobiles might be the subject of such additional tariffs? How concerned are you that the connection between, and by the way, Germany is such an integrated economic player all over Europe that if you hurt Germany, indirectly you hurt France, Romania, because that's a big economy and we are integrated in the European economic space. So where do you think this relation will go? Because if the major European player, Germany today, and the leader of the West and the leader of the alliance, America, are going further apart, where this whole thing will end?
It is quite astonishing to see the deterioration of relations between Berlin and Washington. The relationship has always been very, very special. When times were bad or times were good, that relationship between Germany and the United States is fundamental for the unity of the transatlantic alliance. This is the first point. Secondly, Trump's protectionist policies, they are aimed at America's allies. Mexico, Canada, Europe, and particularly Germany. And this is all in the guise of national security interests. Well, you speak to US security experts and they say this is hogwash. But Trump's particular ire is directed at Angela Merkel for a couple of reasons. One is, to put it simplistically, he's rather jealous of Germany's economy. Two, there's no chemistry between Merkel and Trump. She tried, but she didn't dance with him like Macron did. She doesn't massage people's egos. She's very pragmatic, and as a scientist, she looks for results. And she was treated very badly when she was in Washington last month. Thirdly, and this is related, it's very important to know that I think Trump's treatment of Merkel is because she is still the leader of Europe, undisputed still, despite a weakness in her own coalition. And secondly, everything Trump has done since taking office has been to delegitimate the Obama legacy. And Obama, in the end, got on extremely well with Angela Merkel. And in some ways, Obama delegated the Ukraine crisis in Russia to Merkel, and she took on this responsibility and helped deal with the Minsk Accords. And now he's getting at her further because of the great German car industry. So in some ways, it's a personalized attack, and it'll be very interesting to see how this is going to play out at the NATO summit. Let me pick up on the defense spending. I think we should just get some things right, and we didn't quite deal with the fetish of 2%. I think it's a bit of a fetish, frankly. The Greeks used to spend 7%, but 70% went on personnel costs. And still the personnel costs are still rather high in Greece. They've gone over the 2%. Germany spends about 32 billion euros a year on defense. It's a big amount. The question is, what do they spend it on? And we know the huge problems with procurement, the huge problems with transparency, and the huge heaviness of the German armed forces. It's been so difficult to reform. So spending more to perpetuate a problem, I don't think, is an answer.
Okay. Next year, Romania will hold the rotating semestrial presidency of the EU Council, the first semester of 2019. Really? Yes. And if everything goes according to the schedule, yes, Brexit will legally take place during our presidency. I'm not saying that Romania is a big player in this conversation, but the question is about the UK.
Yeah, oh yeah, great.
And because we are here at the NATO conference, UK is and will always be an indispensable European ally,
yes.
and also strategically speaking for Romania, one of the, together with the US and other major European players, one of our strategic partners.
Yes.
How would be the impact of Brexit on the overall transatlantic conversation and the European defense, and how would Europe look without the UK in strategic and defense matters?
Great question. NATO is, Britain is staying in NATO. That's the good news, okay? Britain, we think, is leaving the EU, okay? And we presume it is. It's a catastrophe, frankly, Britain leaving the EU. From the defence and security point of view, there are two countries that think and act strategically inside the EU. One has been Britain and the other has been France, because of their colonial tradition, because of how they organise themselves. And despite the cutbacks in both the French and British military, the strategic culture was out there, which is very, very important. Now, some experts say, oh, Great Britain is finally leaving. The EU can have its own independent military headquarters. But frankly, some countries hid behind Britain against this. And now that Britain is out, let's see if Europe will get its act together over defence and security. The other aspect which is very important is the political and psychological role that Brexit means to countries like Poland, the Nordic countries, the Netherlands, and to Germany. It's very hard to underestimate the sense of loss if Britain leaves. Britain was part of the triangle between Paris, London and Berlin. And when deals and defence deals had to be done, they did it between Paris and London. When the big economic or political issues had to be done, they went between Berlin and Paris. This special triangle kept the EU balanced in all sorts of alliances. The Poles were very happy with Britain in, because the Poles, the residual fear of the Germans and the French ganging up and then being friends with Russia, or just ganging up and going their own way with the special speed Europe. So an immense gap is being left by Britain, and I think it's only a hunch. I think this is one of the unspoken reasons why Merkel is very reluctant to embrace Macron's reforms full on, because she's afraid of a multi-speed Europe or two-speed Europe that will leave the non-Euro countries behind. So essentially, Brexit opens up lots of cans of worms, and Germany is very well aware of this.
Very interesting. If the UK would leave, it means that in a sort of a natural evolution, Italy and Rome will try to fill in the space, because it's the third, let's say, largest economy in the EU at 27. Now it's fourth. It's a G7 country. But yesterday only, the new Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of the Interior, Mr. Savoni, basically said that together with the Prime Minister Orban from Hungary, they should basically work together and reform the EU regulation and bureaucracy. How do you see this ascent of a trend which we believed was somehow exotic or locally bred?
Yes.
But it seems that this thing is spreading, and now you see an explicit conversation between, let's say, Warsaw and Budapest and Rome. How do you see this thing? How far and how harmful these tendencies could become?
Well, Rome, it's got a bit of chutzpah calling for the reforms of the EU when it doesn't do its own reforms back home, firstly. Secondly, it has promised enormous presence to its electorate, and it's a rather big electorate. Well, somebody has to finance this. So is Rome going to bite the hand that feeds it, which is, in fact, is the European Central Bank and the EU? So I'm hoping that an element of pragmatism, realism might enter the coalition. I'm not entirely optimistic. We may go down the road to future elections, but the Italian economy is unbelievably fragile. So calling for reforms and what they mean by the bureaucracy of the EU, it's really got to start at home, and they're going to need financial assistance to do this. As for Orban looking for allies, well, he's always looking for allies to get at Germany and to get at the EU. But, by the way, if you look at all the opinion polls, whether it's in Poland, whether it's in Hungary, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in Italy, especially in Italy, nobody wants to leave the Eurozone in Italy. And there's a huge majority of those asked in the rest of the countries, huge support for the EU. Isn't that interesting? Huge support for the EU at a time when populist movements are actually challenging the EU. So there's a paradox here that has to be resolved one way or other, and it can be resolved.
Lots of people.
You didn't ask me how. Good.
Lots of people write and forecast that the 21st century would be an Asian century, not that much a Western century, a Western in the original sense of the term. And there's lots of conversation about the rise of China, the Belt and Road Initiative. They're putting some money into this strategic and economic project. How do you think that, other than the intra-European and transatlantic issues and Russia, how do you think that the ascent of China in Asia will impact the cohesion of the West? 16+1, the format. I mean, also this is a huge evolution in world affairs, the rise of China, which is becoming a global superpower in its own right. How would this China factor influence the unity of the West?
Well, first of all, the China factor is not going to go away. And secondly, one cannot even forecast the dynamics that might emerge with this huge growth, the impact of Chinese society itself. Because South Korea was in this situation 30 or 40 years ago, then rapid growth, and then the need for political reform became big. We just don't know how this is going to play out in the long term. It could be unbelievably creative or unbelievably dangerous. We just don't know, because we have a system in China at the moment where the element of surveillance is just horrific, and certainly in some of the cities where the ergos are situated. And I just have to ask myself, is this sustainable? This is the first point. Secondly, yes, the Chinese influence is there. Interestingly, what is happening in Europe at the moment is a big debate about the role of the 16+1. Is this a good thing, China coming in through the back door, the EU? Secondly, France and Britain and Germany are now really taking a hard look at the investment policies that China is pursuing. And thirdly, I'm glad you asked this question. I think you can't lump China with Asia. And what the Asians want is much closer relationship with the EU. I mean, the EU's, excuse the expression, the EU's trump card is trade, actually. And the EU is beginning to start trade negotiations with Australia. They have problems with Singapore, New Zealand. They've done one with Japan Korea, recently. It is so Korea. Important, and the Germans had stopped the Japan one, guess what, because of the four wheels. But the point I want to make is that the EU could actually join in some way the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would be an enormous psychological, economic and political symbol and meaning for the Southeast Asia countries, who actually see the EU in trade terms as kinds of bulwark against China. I use it very carefully, but this is a possibility. So, frankly, it's all very well, oh, China's going to undo the West. Well, let's not sit and wait.
Thank you very much. Now coming back to our own, let's say, closer to our own thing, and also preparing the next exceptional panel that will deal with, let's say, the non-conventional arsenal, or arsenals that are now used. And the previous panels were basically discussing about the long list of means which are today utilized in modern warfare and political and economic influence. Where NATO stops, there are other instruments that are abundantly and aggressively used, let's say, by Russia, but not only by Russia.
Yes.
And how do you think that more, let's say, more recent democracies, more fragile economies, less resilient nations, especially in this part of the eastern flank, the Western Balkans, even Turkey, would end, and how can we eventually fortify ourselves and try to basically
Okay.
be resilient on the whole spectrum
Yes.
of the risks we are faced with?
Yeah. Oh, I'll try to break down the answer. One is communication. NATO and leaders on local level, national level, institutional level, EU level, NATO level, must communicate to the public what is at stake, why security matters, why defence and security matters. Secondly, defence is not, as you say, the conventional. Defence is about dealing with hybrid warfare, disinformation, fake news, social media. And you know the situation of the media here in your own country. It demands an enormous element to break through and ensure a centre ground for real communication to citizens. Citizens must be involved. It's absolutely crucial. Thirdly, resilience, this gets back to the communication. What does resilience mean? There are two definitions. Well, there are many. Resilience means that if you are attacked, how societies can get back on their feet as quickly as possible. So you have to think in the long term, preparing the water structures, your energy facilities, housing, medical centres, hospitals, schools, everything basic that you take for granted. The 21st century means that we can't take anything for granted anymore. And the other aspect of resilience is rather negative, the resilience of certain leaders to remain in power. And so, I mean, we have seen this with Assad, thanks to Russia and other reasons. We've seen the resilience of some of your political parties here, frankly. The ability to stay in power, and you have to ask why. So the negative side of resilience, which we have to tackle head on. But my last point is, I go back to the first one, the 21st century, because of the crowded space, because of the competition for information, we have to be really, really forceful in projecting the truth, and that means finding a common centre ground that is inclusive, not exclusive, and not demonizing.
Thank you so much. It's 3 o'clock sharp. Judy will stay on the next panel. A big round of applause to one of the most interesting and challenging intellectuals of our time. Now, Dorin Pena, Aspen Fellow and General Manager of Cisco, will take over the hostilities. Alina Bărgăuanu, please join us, and the rest of the panelists. Judy stays. She's a prisoner of war in Bucharest.
Okay, we can start. Good afternoon from my side. Thank you, Mr. Joanna, for the invitation and for the honor of moderating the last panel of this great event and moderating the discussion with some amazing people, some great people. Mr. Joanna already introduced Judy, and we thank her for being with us today. And also Mrs. Alina Bărgăuanu, member of the high-level expert group on fake news and digital disinformation, European Commission, and Mr. Adrian Pătrăluță, head of analysis division, Romanian Intelligence Service. Thank you very much for being with us today. And we hope we're going to have a great discussion. I propose some topics, and I will ask each one of you to say your opinion. And just before going to the topics, just a short introduction from my side. Some words I remember from the discussions today. I think we discussed about cyber warfare, about different directions in which we discuss about how people interact today, about the importance of information and the importance of coherence and trust between allies. Mr. John already made a small transition towards what we see today, because we discussed today in a room, which is physical, and we can see it, we see the chairs, we see the people. There are some very interesting facts that I would like to bring to your attention. We are roughly 7.5 billion people today on this planet, and interestingly enough, around 4 billion are connected to the internet. Around 3.1 billion people are on different social platforms, and close to 3 billion, more exactly 2.9 billion, are mobile users of social platforms, which means that they have access very, very fast to information. Also, we have around 2 billion active users on Facebook, and I'm sure that everyone heard the news and followed the news about what's happening with Facebook. We had a visit, including in Europe, of CEO of Facebook, and 350 million users every month of Twitter. Of course, Twitter is a very important platform. Now, with these things in mind, I would like to open up with the first question. How do you see the impact of technology in today's lives and also in beliefs? How do you see life in cyberspace? And also very important, can we talk about Western values in the cyberspace? So from the first...
with High Life.
From the High Life, yes.
Since I'm part of High Life, I will be the first. Is this on? Because, okay, yes, it is. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. Thank you, Mr. John, for this kind honor that you are bestowing on me. I hope that it has to do with my position as the expert in the high-level expert group and also with my previous experience regarding mass media and mass communication. I'm deeply honored and even deeply touched by being part of this panel. I think that what you have presented is already scary enough, but I think that the situation is even scarier. By the way, I will start with a short confession. This is not the best time because I had a huge fight with my 13-year daughter regarding her social media behavior. So last week I was in a more friendly mood regarding social media, but today I'm completely changed. So fortunately or unfortunately for the topic, I think that leaving the humorous tone aside, I think that the digital space is a complete game changer. It changes the quality of information, it changes the quantity of information, it changes the distribution cycle. Mainstream media is taken out of the distribution cycle. And let me quote from a famous author, Niall Ferguson. He's a British historian, and he said that he makes a very good comparison between the invention of the printing press and the invention of Facebook, and I tend to think that he is right. And he said that after the invention of the printing press, there were 200 years of civil war in Europe. So if we maintain this comparison, probably we can expect a very, very long period of accommodation, and probably not civil war by traditional terms, and probably not 200 years, because now the distance is shortened, time is shortened, but I think that there are huge changes. And also we are talking a lot about Facebook and about social, of course, Facebook is the dominant player, but there are a lot of platforms that are below radar. And again, coming back to my fight with my daughter, our fight had to do with WhatsApp, which I think is even a big changer, of a game changer as compared to Facebook. And this is completely untransparent. It is completely below the radar. It is anonymous. We consider this as being private space. And we do not have any kind of research tool or conceptual tool to deal with what is flowing through these personal platforms, let's say. This is why the notion of public space that we endorse is completely outdated. It is, we are talking about the network space, which is neither private, which is neither public, which is not anonymous, which is collective, which what we are dealing here is with something which is completely new.
Judy?
Well, I won't tell you the discussions I have with our three sons. But they're serious discussions, which is very good, because they're under immense peer pressure from their classmates. And so let's look at the good. Well, what's happening now, because the studies that are finally being slowly undertaken about the impact of social media on the very young generation, there's now a discussion beginning on how to deal with this. The responsibilities of the social media, the one that you mentioned, is a bit worrying. But I think we couldn't stop the printing press, and why should we? And you cannot stop progress. But since we are now hyper-aware of social media, just as a footnote, we thought social media was great during the Arab Spring, but now look at how it's been taken over by Sisi and others, because they realise the power of social media. But I think there is a growing awareness out there of the need to regulate social media. If newspapers, television, radio faced regulation and continue to face regulation, why can't there be regulatory systems for social media? It's difficult, it's brand new, to keep the lawyers busy, but it's very, very important. The second real concern of social media, and maybe this I'd be interested to hear what you have to say on this, is what it does to sharing intelligence, or what it does to faking information, how it can be highly disruptive. Again, this may feed into the regulatory issues. You asked us about, of course they're affecting our lives, there's no doubt about this. But I still think that there has to be much more public engagement on this, not through social media, but on all sorts of levels of the society, and in order to create some kind of neutral space. I think what's lacking with social media now is the neutrality of the space, and I don't know how that's going to be dealt with.
Adrian?
First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting us. It's an opportunity and an honor to be here and to listen to the conversation. And I think it was an informative and productive debate. For me, it's a little bit unusual. We don't really like to take stand. We like to be more discreet. But I will try to join in the conversation and contribute. Of course, also for us, social media and all this development is presenting at times obstacles, but I think we can find the means to overcome these obstacles. And when it comes to sharing intelligence and cooperation with our partners, this doesn't really put more obstacle for us, but it encourages us to work better and to work together. And on the other hand, I like to see also the bright side, because there is also a bright side, not only the social media, but the entire IT&C segment in our country is a major engine of our industry and a big contributor to the state budget. So, of course, it has obstacles, but it is our job to overcome these obstacles and to try to look at the bright side.
Thank you for your input. I think you've already opened up some new topics for discussion for the next question. And before going to the next question, I just wanted to tell you some very interesting facts again. According to a recent poll, 77% of Americans now believe that major news outlets report falsehood, so false news. Worse, 42% believe that journalists do this reporting on purpose. If we look at a digital news report done by Reuters Institute, across 3 dozens of countries in Europe, only 40% of people say they trust the news. Only 40%. And if we look at some of the countries which were mentioned earlier, like Hungary or France, the statistics is even worse. Adrian said that there are great advantages of having quick access to information. In the same time, there is a risk. So there is the cybersecurity risk and a very, very important the risk of fake news. And now my question is, what exactly is this fake news concept? Is it something real? Is it something more of a buzzword? How do the fake news affect us? And which are the actors creating and playing with the fake news?
Thank you. Say I answer it in a completely different way. That fake
Your
news...
Your choice.
Thank you. Fake news is the 21st century answer to the old kind of Soviet propaganda that existed during the Cold War. And it's now just accentuated and highlighted because of the speed and digitization, which we didn't mention, and we didn't mention AI, I'm sure we'll go into this. So fake news is an incredibly quick channel for disinformation, for misinformation, and it breeds distrust. Now, what is interesting is that Russia latched onto this quite early on, and we see the disinformation over the downing of the MH17 and the little green men in eastern Ukraine. The Chinese don't have to do fake news. They just control everything on the social media now. As for us, the West, we have to decide which way we're going to go down. Are we going to play this disinformation game as we did with the broadcasting systems, Radio Free Europe, A Voice of America, the BBC External Service, remember that in the 70s or 80s? Or are we seriously going to embrace this digitization and try to break through this fake news? I don't know how it's going to be done, but we did it in a much more unsophisticated way during the Cold War. But this is now a new not a new Cold War, but this is now a revolution in the media. And it's going to take a huge amount of political will, working with the private and the public sectors to deal with this.
Thank you.
Thank you for this question. I'm not reciprocating how Mark Zuckerberg answered the questions. Senator, this is a fantastic question when he didn't know what to say. But really, this is my favorite question, what is fake news? Because as part of the high-level expert group, I work specifically on this topic, what we are talking about when pronouncing the term fake news, together with two professors, one from Sorbonne University and one from Harvard University. So I was very lucky to be part of this conceptual group. And we identified some reason why fake news is a non-starter for a serious discussion, including regulation. And you will have all kind of details on my presentation that will be on my website. And I'll try to summarize. So the first reason why the term fake news is a non-starter is that it has started to be politicized, even weaponized. A little bit of a background, the term popped out of nowhere up until November 2016, when it was brought up to the attention of the whole world by now President Trump during the electoral campaign, when he used the term in relation to the legacy media, to the conventional media, saying, you, CNN, New York Times, you are a very dishonest person, you are spreading fake news about me. And he continued with this mantra during the inauguration, and then he established the prizes for fake news, which were given for some opinions expressed by Paul Krugman, for example, in New York Times. So this is why we consider that the term is a non-starter, because it has become politicized, and now in order to set facts right, it has been politicized by all parties, by both parties, let's say. But there are more conceptual reasons why the term is a non-starter. First of all, and I'm trying to summarize, because fake news is not fake and it is not news. It is not completely fake, but it spans the whole continuum from more factual information to something which can be completely fabricated. So true, false, and anything in between. It is not only news, because, for example, when we watch the legacy media, we know that this is a journalistic type, these are news, but in social media we are dealing with information, with emotions, we are doing with moral panics, we are dealing with pictures, we are dealing with memes, we are doing with faked videos, so everything that is not news, with opinions, with wild opinions, for example. Another reason why fake news is only a subtype of digital disinformation is that the digital content is amplified by our digital behavior, what the Cambridge Analytica scandal exposed to the whole world. By every like that we make, by every share, we amplify the content which can be fake or false, but we are factors of amplification. Coming back to your question about who amplifies the content. The other reason why fake news is only a subtype of the much larger phenomenon of digital disinformation is that the content can be amplified by technological means. And I have in mind, of course, bots, trolls, like armies, networks of bots, and many other things. But I also have in mind technological amplification, which is used by everybody again, such as big data, metadata, computational propaganda, computational persuasion, precision segmentation, and stuff like that. So what we are dealing with is a much larger phenomenon which is not fake, which is not news. And lately I have started not to use even the term of digital disinformation, but I'm using the term of content, which is digital, which is algorithmic, and which is data-driven. So this is what we are dealing with, and this is the background against which pseudo-facts, disinformation may fall into. But again, I'm not trying to scare you, because I think that we are all aware that we are dealing with something huge. And my point is that it is not, we do not have to take things for granted and say this is it. But what I'm trying to say is that technologies are double-edged swords. They have good effects, as you have underlined very, very aptly, but they can go both ways. And I don't think that there is such thing as good propaganda or bad propaganda, good precision segmentation and bad precision segmentation. We have to understand that these are two-edged swords.
Thank you. Adrian?
Well, I'm pretty sure nobody here wants to hear the intelligence and security service talking about regulating this environment, so I'll leave this aside. But I will start with a quote from Joseph Nye, who said that power sometimes depends on whose army or economy wins, but it can also depend on whose story wins. So, yes, we are looking careful at what is happening, but you have to understand that it's very difficult, first of all, to identify propaganda themes being disseminated, and even more challenging to attribute those propaganda themes to a certain adversary. As I said, we are looking carefully. We are trying to see if there are risks or threats to our national security, but it's the place of civil society, and it's the place of our political decision makers to regulate this field of activity.
Please.
Just a short reaction to regulation, and again, based on my experience at the high-level expert group, of course, there was a lot of discussion that we shouldn't regulate content, but this is a false discussion, because when we are talking about regulating social media or finding some 21st century regulation, nobody is talking about regulation, about content, because this is censorship. Immediately when you start talking about regulation, regulating the content, the word censorship pops up. But I think that you can regulate a lot of things. You can regulate access to who places ads in the social media. You can bring a lot of transparency regarding funding sources. So coming back to your survey regarding traditional media, whether you will like the traditional media or not, in Romania or elsewhere, there is a lot of transparency regarding traditional media. Again, even in Romania, we may not like a certain TV station, but we know who the owner is. We know which are the funding sources. We know how the ad revenues are generated, but there is no such thing as transparency regarding social media. And I understand that there are some things that are proposed in the United States, including the honesty ad bid, honesty at bill, for example. So I think that, of course, regulation is the last resort solution, and I agree that this should be left to the politicians, to the political class, but I don't think that we should avoid regulation from the start, as Mark Zuckerberg, of course, proposed.
Well, Chancellor Angela Merkel's last government, the Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, who was the Justice Minister, I mean, they came down pretty heavily, frankly, on Facebook and social media. A, because of the Constitution, and Germany has a particular constitution when it comes to hate messages, and how the far right-wing Alternative for Deutschland use this, but other neo-Nazi groups as well. And they were supported by the public on this, generally speaking. So what we're getting into is the fine line between regulation and democracy and censorship. But, I mean, is it censorship that you stick to the Constitution and you tell Zuckerberg to take off that hate mail within a few hours and then fine him if he doesn't? I mean, these are important questions, and interestingly, that Merkel knew exactly what she was doing even 6 or 8 months before the elections last October. She said it would be a really hard-fought one, not just because of the fragmentation of German politics, but she knew how Russia was going to try to disrupt it.
To the point that you already raised the regulation and some of the things you mentioned, I just popped to my mind something I saw recently, actually this morning. Very interesting. The last The Economist in Europe, the European edition, has a red front cover with 3 letters on it, the surveillance state. Now, there is this debate always, what should you do? Should you give up some rights in order to get security? Should you be free to do whatever you think it's fair or whatever you consider you should do? And in the end, I come back to values, and I come back to the topic of our panel, which is maintaining unity in action. And my question, or the topic I would like to raise, should we make a step back and think on what exactly do we want to achieve? Which are the values we are pursuing? What are the goals we want to reach? And what are the things that are bridges between us? Because if we look around Europe and also in US, there is a clear trend of okay, we have to find a way to understand better what's happening, and we have to find a way to protect our citizens. But until now, there are different approaches. Europe, for example, has adopted GDPR, which is a very important step. So, coming back to these values and objectives, how do you see the things evolving, or how should we approach the problem?
So you have raised an important topic which connects to the topic of the whole conference regarding the unity of the Western world, and I was privileged to listen to your previous conversation. The point I'm trying to make is that this information has to do with interest. And I'm quoting, this is a fair, simple statement, but it was made by Pope Francis, who said that there is no such thing as harmless disinformation. So when we are talking about disinformation, we are talking about interests. And these interests are commercial, these interests are political, and of course these interests are geopolitical. Now, as some sort of an inside information about the group, I try to say that interests are commercial, political, and geopolitical, but the phrase with geopolitical was erased. So it was only political interest. So I think that in order to find disinformation, I think that the Western world should clarify its interest, its common interest, and its common voice. Because if there is divergence at the highest level, of course, this is the perfect ground for disinformation. Last week, I think after the Italian election, there was a not a very inspired statement made by the budget commissioner, Oettinger, who said that he hopes that the markets will teach Italians how to choose right during the next elections. And I made a comment on my online journal that with statements like this, who needs this information? There is no need for Putin to attack us or for Chinese to control or whatever to do when there are these statements brought up to the public. And no matter how quickly Donald Tusk came to say that we should respect the choice of citizens, this is already too little, too late. So my point is that we should pay attention to the unity of the interests, to the unity of these alliances, because otherwise disinformation will be there. And to paraphrase, disinformation starts at home.
Thank you.
I think I will stick to my previous statement that this is not the job of an intelligence or security service. But there are some fields of activity where we feel the need for, let's say, a more clear and robust legal framework, and this is the field of cyber attacks. Because in a cyber attack, you can see, I mean, the threat or the risk is more concrete sometimes, and you can see it. And sometimes with great effort, but sometimes you can even attribute it. So this is one field of activity where we feel the need for a more clear, pragmatic, and robust legal framework. But going back to the topic of our panel, maintaining unity in action, I think at least the service I represent can paint not such a gloomy picture, but even an encouraging one, a hopeful one. Because when it comes to security services, when it comes to the Romanian intelligence service, I can tell you that we have very, and I mean very strong partnerships with our counterparts, with the intelligence and security services, especially from NATO and EU countries. And this cooperation goes most of the times very, very deep in operational details. Also, we are contributing a lot, and we are equal partners in multilateral formats of cooperation, both within NATO and the EU. And I think when it comes to the cooperation of intelligence and security services, nobody doubts the importance of maintaining unity in action. Thank you.
That's very interesting. Thank you for this. Can I just jump in here very briefly? You mentioned the values.
Of course.
I think the sharing intelligence is always tricky. You really have to trust your partner. And there's elements of distrust inside NATO and how far certain big countries will share the intelligence. But it's a point well taken that this happens on an equal basis from what you were saying. But this sharing of intelligence and this element of security must in some ways be connected to our values, because our values are our democratic system. And without these values, our democratic systems will be eroded. And these values and our democratic institutions cannot be taken for granted. And social media has exposed the vulnerability of our values. And the more the EU and NATO can share, I think in some ways, the more these values can be brought to the fore, that they are part of the Euro-Atlantic architecture.
I think coming back to values, because you ended up with values, there is a challenge people have right now, because they face something unprecedented. It's for the first time in history we deal with computers, with artificial intelligence, with machine learning, with things like this. And also from news perspective, now the amount of news is huge. And unfortunately, the capacity of our brains hasn't evolved in the last 50 years with the internet. And this poses a huge challenge to people. How can we deal with it as individuals? I'm not talking necessarily about regulation, I'm not talking necessarily about political systems. I'm talking about individuals. What should people do to really understand the values? Because, I don't know, 500 years ago, people were understanding the values from the family or from the church or from institutions very close to their community. Now these communities are being redefined. One of the drivers of this redefinition is technology. So what's your view on this? What's your advice? You have different experiences. You see things from different points of view. What should a regular person do in this new age?
So I think that there is a lot of things that we can do as individuals, but I do not want to place the responsibility or the burden of responsibility with the citizens. Before going to the citizens, we have regulators, we have public intellectuals, we have politicians, we have all kinds of agencies. So until we go back to the poor citizen who has a very short attention span, who has to generate revenues for his or her family, has to bring up kids, has to be involved in his personal life, and we want him to fact-check information. So I think that the citizen is the last in this chain. But
we still live in a democracy,
yes,
so
yes.
They vote.
Of course. So I think that regulation regarding transparency is one interest. Some literacy, for example, some technological literacy for politicians and decision makers is another solution. So again, if we jump directly to citizen, it is some sort of a huge leap regarding responsibility. So, of course, we can talk about literacy, but again, I think that we should start with digital and technological literacy for decision makers and politicians, because, for example, what the Mark Zuckerberg's hearings in the US Senate exposed is a very low technological literacy among the congressmen, for example. But in order to go back to what the poor citizen can do, I think that we can practice a lot of our emotions. Because social media is not so much full with information, with facts, but it is full with emotions. And I think that we can practice some sort of emotional skepticism. For example, I told you that I was, as part of this high-level expert group, I was a colleague with Claire Wardle at Harvard University, and she did some research regarding the relevance and the efficiency of fact-checkers. And she discovered that these are very efficient, but not in checking the facts, but in teaching people how to manage their emotions. So apparently, when you are faced with different perspectives, it is not that you become more factual. It is not that you gain access to the ultimate truth or stuff like this, but you are more aware of your emotions. And for example, she recommended that when we are exposed to some very controversial content, to step aside for 30 minutes and not to have any kind of reaction of social media, to judge a little bit, and only that to have some sort of a reaction. So probably this is a trivial example. The idea is that I consider the topic of emotional awareness to be highly relevant because we talk about news and information, but actually social media is full with emotions, with moral outrage, with anger, with frustration, and facts are the least of our concerns.
Very briefly, 30 minutes is a long time. Secondly, I think I know who you're referring to, Mohammed. Yeah, I was up in Estonia at one of these particular conferences on digitization, and we looked at the emotional impact of social media, and the emotional impact of social media is based on personal legitimacy. And you may just tweet once, and then you get 25 tweets agreeing with you, and you feel empowered. And so it becomes a vicious circle. I don't know how this is going to be resolved, and I don't even know how to answer your question. One interesting little detail, Germany is renowned for many things. It is also infamous for its slow level of VLAN and digitization. It's unbelievably backward in terms of the EU. But the flip side of this is that the German news on the state in the state-run channels, ARD and ZDF, they are fantastically fact-driven and pretty boring. But the audience is going up. Out of what is seeing, the population of Germany is 75 million, so 40 million adults maybe. But the evening primetime news is at 8 p.m. and at least 10 million people every evening look at those news, because there's a feeling that it can be trusted. And I think trust is a very important component.
Thank you.
Well, you can always switch off the TV and cut the internet. That's one solution. But I'm not sure I have an answer. I can tell you what I do. I just look for the facts, use statistics, go back to fundamentals, and then I try to make decisions. Because imagine my situation, so I have all the media on one hand at my disposal, and then secret intelligence on the other hand, so it's even more information coming my way. So I'm trying to always look for the facts, try to verify them, try to be very accurate, because when working in an intelligence service, you have to be very accurate when you are saying something. That's all.
I think, Adrian, this is a very powerful advice coming from a specialist who, in his activity, barely has space for mistakes, and probably we're gonna see more and more discussions about how people can become more factual and more reasonable and understand their emotions. Now, heading towards the end of our panel, I have one more question, which is a bit more regional, because we discussed broader issues. We discussed about topics which can be applied in general. Now, coming back to our region, our Black Sea region, and coming back to the topic of our panel, which is unity, and putting these two things into the perspective of what we discussed about cyberspace, about fake news. What would you say are the biggest challenges we have in our region against the unity? So things which fight us or fight the unity we want to achieve, specific to our region. Anyone?
Sorry, the question again?
The question is, if we look at our region, Black Sea region, and if we look at fake news and cyberspace, what are the challenges we face here locally? What are the things are more threatening to us and can threaten the unity we aim with our partners across the Atlantic and not only? So threaten this unity that we talk about.
I suppose I'm at a disadvantage or an advantage. First of all, I don't live here, but
you see it from outside. I suppose you read about.
But I think it's a really important question, because I think the Romanian security, not in the conventional sense, I think the Romanian security is being undermined by the kind of level of the political discourse, actually. Security is about safeguarding the democratic institutions and the infrastructure and the values. And somehow I think these very important issues of the West get drowned in the polemics among the political parties. And I think this is quite damaging for Romania's democratic institutions and the separation of the state and the society.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for opening this up. I think that one of the greatest challenges in Romania, but elsewhere, and I think that in the United States too, is the extent of polarization. I think that this is the illness of the 21st century in the Western world, because the Western world is not divided along geographical lines, but it is divided along horizontal lines. We have two hostile camps across the Western world. that do not talk to each other, but they talk about each other and they yell at each other. So this is happening in Romania too. I think that polarization is even a greater threat than post-fact, post-whatever. And I think until we come up with some common ground, some common interest, again, in Romania, or along the Western world, I can dare say that in the United States too, we cannot talk about common action. And in order to come up with this common action, we have to recognize that these two camps are both legitimate. If one camp considers itself to be morally superior to tell the other camp what to do, what to say, how to feel, I think that we'll be completely trapped in this vicious circle of disinformation, outrage, and again, two hostile camps that do not talk to each other, but talk about each other, and they yell at each other.
From a security perspective, the risks and threats that we see, we've already discussed about it. Cyber attacks, it's sometimes propaganda threats, it's countering terrorism, it's illegal migration in connection to terrorism, especially when it comes to the Black Sea. And us, as a domestic intelligence and security service, we are looking very careful at all these threats and putting a lot of emphasis on prevention. But there is more, I would say. And going back to our discussion, or at least about going back to the mental model that I use when there is overwhelming information, I always go back to basics, to the fact that we are part of a political and military alliance. We are part of an economic alliance, the EU. We have very strong partnerships with democratic countries, and I think it's a lot, and we can build on that. And I very much liked, when it comes to the Black Sea, not to look only at risk and threats, but also to opportunities. And I don't have more information than the presentation that was already done by a colleague of ours about the economic opportunities in the Black Sea, because the Black Sea has a double dimension from an economic viewpoint. It can become, in the very near future, a very important source of energy, and because of it, Romania can also become a hub for energy transit, and this can bring us a lot of input, and we can really build on this and become stronger as a nation, but also stronger together with our allies from NATO and EU.
Thank you so much. I think we have some time left for questions. So if you have questions for our dear speakers.
Thank you so much. Irina Tvashilashvili from Georgia. The question, do you see any perspective of EU institutions or transatlantic institutions towards prevention of Russian propaganda or so-called fake news or disinformation flows that are created in a language of not in English? Do you see it's important or not? Because when we come to Black Sea region, the countries of Eastern Partnership, members of Eastern Partnership or Black Sea region, and the platform where these news or disinformation flows are spread, actually, they are not in English, they are in Russian. Thank you very much.
To whom is the question addressed in general? So anyone wants to pick the...
Very quickly, we are under some time pressure. There was a lot of reluctance at the level of the high-level expert group in order to mention Russia specifically. So probably this kind of reluctance was to be understood. And there were some mentions that some attention should be placed to regional groups such as Central and Eastern Europe. Also, there was a mention in the report that the Commission should work in alliance with other actors, such as the Stratcom and other institutions. And leaving the reluctance aside, I think that in order to deal with Russian propaganda, we are talking about a multitasking and multi-institutional endeavor. So that was my answer. I hope it answered your question. The suggestion was to collect all the questions and then to briefly respond.
Okay, so I think because we are under time pressure, should we take one more question and that's it? Is it okay, Judy? Okay, so one more question.
Hi, my name is Oana Popescu, and Global Focus, the think tank that I run, has come up with an analysis of what makes us vulnerable to propaganda and disinformation. And one of the main conclusions was that this needs to be a whole-of-society approach. And as Judy emphasized earlier as well, there needs to be cooperation between the citizens and governments. But my question is, how do you do that when the confidence gap between citizens and governments is huge at this point in the West, and it's one of the main vulnerabilities? So do you see any way of going about this? And then the second question to Mrs. Bădgăoanu, very briefly, if you look at the Riga Stratcom agenda coming up in just next week, you'll see it has shifted completely from last year. It's focusing now so much on artificial intelligence and how to deal with it. Whereas the European Union is focusing very much on fact-checking and perhaps promoting quality journalism. Is this a matter of dividing tasks, or is it a matter of miscommunication? Because the two seem to be on completely different pages. Thank you.
Another question, please. Could be a rhetoric question. We see in the last 300 years, we are finding security solution against the testament of Peter I. How many years do you think we need to find the right solution to requirements of testament of Peter I? Thank you. Could be a rhetoric question.
Oana, thank you for this, and I'm sorry I won't be at your conference. There's a real chance to say sorry. I'm beginning to be won over by your more optimistic argument. I think that, yes, the polarization in other parts of Europe is not as deep as the polarization here. It's getting very deep in Romania, in Poland. It's quite deep in Hungary. Germany, it's not polarized because the politicians speak out and they communicate. And Chancellor Merkel has now started doing town hall meetings, and so do other politicians, frankly. You may think I'm a real conservative in a small sense and traditionalist, but communication is not rocket science. And I'm not talking about the social media communication. It's about getting out to people in communication. Macron is pulling up his shirt sleeves and doing this for the European elections, for heaven's sake. And Green politicians are doing this in Germany now, and they're going over Europe. It needs politicians to get out of their bubbles. And politicians... One other point, and then I'll keep quiet. It's leaving aside your country. The role of a politician is immensely complex now, and the demands and the expectations. And you wonder, what any foreign minister or chancellor or interior minister, endless traveling, endless sharing of intelligence, keeping a track of everything. And so the expectations are quite high. But on the other hand, the public has a role to play on how they're going to communicate as well, and grassroots have to mobilize. And we have seen these pro-European movements. I think, as I said in my earlier remarks, the communication is absolutely key to create a neutral central ground that is inclusive, and it can be done.
And a very brief answer to your question, and we can continue the conversation. I hope that these are complementary endeavors. The question of intelligence and major political decision was explicitly taken out of the report in order not to create, in order to come up with consensus. But the report is pretty multi-layered. It is not only with dealing with journalism, but it deals with the diversification of the digital landscape. Not because there was at the beginning, of course, the group started with quality journalism and fake news. And this is why we switch attention from fake news to digital disinformation. And instead of diversifying the media landscape, for example, we said diversifying of the digital landscape. The report makes reference to digital literacy, to technological literacy, to research, to documenting, to even possible regulating amplification, technological amplification. So I hope, I'm not pretty sure, probably this is wishful thinking within some limits, but these approaches are complementary. And the group was trying to be representative for the whole European Union, to be representatives of all the partners, and there was a strive for consensus. This is why the references to intelligence was explicitly left out.
So I think that the time is up. I would like to end up with Adrian's perspective. I think we face threats indeed, but we also face many opportunities, and I think we should believe in our unity. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Adrian, for your contribution, and thank you, everyone, for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, the moderator, for a great panel. I don't know if this is working. I just want to thank everybody for coming here yesterday and today, and for staying with us through the panels and through what I think was a very interesting discussion. I'm not sure we actually answered the question. We definitely are all bracing for the storm. I'm not sure if we answered the second part of the question: is united Western action possible? And even more so, if it's possible, is it probable? But maybe that's something that we can dig more into in our future events. Aspen Institute together with the German Marshall Fund Bucharest. I do want to thank all the speakers, all the moderators, but I also want to thank the teams, Aspen Romania team and German Marshall Fund Bucharest team, for their very diligent work throughout yesterday, today, and in putting this together. Thank you again very, very much. And again, see you at our next events. And safe travels to those who came here from other countries.